Today, this All Saints' Day, as I considered what I might say, and I have wrestled this week, I had to be honest and recognise that today I stand in a place of not knowing. I'm not sure it's the place I'm meant to stand, seeing as how I'm up here in this pulpit, in a church where I think often there's an expectation that some form of knowing at least will be spoken of. And surely this day, the poignant and powerful time when we risk remembering and drawing close our loved ones who have died, surely this is the day we should speak with confidence of hope and promise. Of course, to stand not knowing is not necessarily to stand without confidence. Perhaps the challenge is to be confident to remain standing when we are discomforted by not knowing. To stand not knowing and remember those saints of long ago, loved ones whose loss exposes that we are vulnerable to love and to life. We are made aware of our mortality, that death is for all of us. To stand not knowing this day and expect to see the saints in our day, and perhaps more alarmingly, to expect to see that we too embody saintliness in our day. And the way we live might just be that which causes an expectation for there to be example embodied in the lives of those yet to come. Not knowing. What is that exactly? Is it an in-between knowing state, a transition time between certainties, a stumble before we find our feet again? Or might it have its own integrity? We struggle, I think, to find words to articulate those moments when we simply are stunned to not know, and often they occur around the times of death. And then we might find words, but we know that they're not going to stand up to the scrutiny of reason and logic and science and intellect and plain common sense. So quite reasonably, rather than take time to dwell with and learn from that time where we simply don't know, we hasten from that encounter. For some, the explanation of times of death and the fact we simply don't know is to say that, well, we've had a good life, and the explanation is that we live in a physical world and we have our bodies and that's all there is, and we shouldn't expect more than what we know. The tangible reality of life is the limit. Anything else is imagining and wishful thinking. That we should expect to be responsible for living well and rightly, to align with ways of living that enable the flourishing of life in all creation. That we should not defer these things to some afterlife time or expectation that God will tweak or reset the dial to make things right. After all, we have been told many ways. We have been given many clues of how to live in right relationship with one another in the world and to lead a life that brings transformation, even as we never quite get there. Today's Beatitudes from the Gospel remind us that there is consequences to the ways we choose to live. Our habits of behaviour have outcomes, and they reverberate throughout creation. So is there no more than us? Is God a creation of our highest ideals? As Lloyd Gearing suggested, the sum of our meaningfulness known by the way we live and are together. I think it is important in this time of unknowing to sit with this also, to consider that this could be true. For you see, we cannot prove it one way or another. And for many, it enables them, this way of understanding, to live well, to orient themselves in the world, to focus on life, giving well and generously, and not depending on some unprovable God concept to make things right later. But for others, God so imagined diminishes the horizons of life and hope, removes the potential in and the possibility of life, and burdens them, because life thus becomes a self-creation, and they may not be well-resourced to create a very good life. The reality for most of us is that we spend a good part of our lives in busyness, creating and participating in worlds of certainty and purpose. We negotiate our way through the expectations and responsibilities of our society with our desires and drives for individual expression and authenticity. And most of us function well enough most of the time. We don't question too much. We expect perhaps not so much. That's life. We might agitate for this or that, seek to right this wrong or protest that injustice, but we probably don't test the boundaries of life too much. Despite our best laid plans, however, life, or perhaps I should say death, has a nasty habit of breaking into our complacency and disrupting the order of our days. Death faces us with not life. Not life is something we, again, do not know. And we experience rather than know our responses at those times, and we can speak of what we do know. We become stripped bare of what we are certain of. We are made aware of how constructed our lives are, how secure they seem and yet vulnerable when the linchpin of life is pulled away. All that has been our world shrinks, our priorities diminish, and we are left wondering what matters most. And surprisingly, there is little that matters most. Reduced to what's most precious, to relationships, to the way we care and nurture, support, sustain one another, to those memories and pictures and taste, touch, sound. All those intangible things matter most. And we also discover curious things about that love we've theorized about. We discover it as a lived and an embodied thing, and how easy it is to speak of love honestly and truthfully, and of love mutuality, that we lose part of ourselves when we lose another. We discover that despite the fact that we spend most of our lives doing and creating and participating in the physical world, what matters most are the intangible things. When we have those moments where we say, we don't know, we opened up in a curious way because we haven't burdened ourselves with stuff. Our certainties are suspended. Our world is no longer as it was. We are less sure of who we are or how we are to live. And when we gather with all those people that we know are very different for us in those moments, very different from us, and normally we'd probably argue quite a lot, the differences between us are there with us, even though we each gathered and are not knowing. We remain together because there's deeper than our differences, and we need each other. We need the resourcefulness of our being different to piece a world together again. So today, much as the Beatitudes spoke about the things of mourning, the things that will be different afterward, today we are talking of death and life, of the tangible physical world and the intangible world of relationships. We're asking questions about whether life is just in this world or whether it's more than this world. And our differences arise as we wrestle with those things and with our mortality. And the differences that we have repercussions in how we understand God and how we live and what we hope for and what the world can include. But for all our eloquence, all we can truly say is without death, there is no life. Without the tangible, we don't know what intangible is. All we can know is what life is this side of death. Not knowing is how we can live with that paradox. It allows us to dwell and to learn, because life and death are both present there. The reality that we dedicate most of our life to real intangible things, even though intangible are most foundational to us. When faced with death, we stand before we do not know together. Together, we do not know. With our differences, we are opened to each other. We're open to try and understand the other, to see their world, to see who we are and who we each are more generously. It is our differences that teach and challenge us to consider our choices and our understandings and to go to negotiate how we live life with all its paradox. The call in our life today is the call to be saints, and the Beatitudes remind us to be people who live in a way that means that God's justice may come to life. We also know that as humans we are complicated, obtuse and obstinate, determined too often not to listen to those things but to follow the urgings of our hearts and wills. Through encountering and entering into and engaging with difference, with the struggles and trials and tribulations, wrong turnings and mistruths of those others we meet who are different from us in our times of trusting each other, we learn a lot about how and whether and what we choose, and about ourselves. Do we test our choices and our understandings by insulating ourselves from those other options, from difference? Or do we let them indwell us for a time so that we can learn to develop resilience and honest truthfulness? On this day, when we speak of ourselves as saints of this age, we are aware that the paradox of life is that opposites coexist. We speak in the Beatitudes of the poor, of those who mourn, of those who are merciful, and those who are peacemakers. But if opposites coexist and we are to serve this world, then it is our call to walk alongside the poor, but they are not poor if they are not rich, those who mourn and those who are joyful, those who are merciful, those who are merciless, peacemakers and warmongers. We are called to alleviate suffering, to be courageous in the face of ridicule when we dare to insist that the world can be of just dealing and equitable sharing. The story that we tell is grounded in Christ. Yet it has edges that are wide open to be surprised by God, to discover that God is also in the difference of others. And I think as we are open to hear, as we are willing to engage with those who are different from us, we discover a more complete story of our world, a world where injustice is known because of justice, inequity because of equity. Which of these comes to prevail depends on the wideness of our inclusion of difference when we are all faced with what we do not know. You see, the world's story doesn't necessarily or inevitably have to unravel the way it most often does. Today I stand before you, still in my not knowing. But I stand not alone, in the company of the saints of days and years gone by, in your company, the saints of this day. Together, blessed by our differences, we saints that tell one particular faith story, can we be part of unraveling the story differently in our world, of incarnating in word and in deed a just and equitable world that includes and welcomes and values the richness of all our differences?